From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Last year, we cataloged a very, very powerful book written by our author this afternoon, D.T. Max. The name of the book is Every Love Story is a Ghost Story, A Life of David Foster Wallace. This biography of Wallace, the famous and controversial author of the novel Infinite Jest, takes on a very controversial subject with both objectivity and compassion. In reading it, I wondered how any author could combine both qualities in such a powerful way. But D.T. Max managed the same combination in his earlier book, The Family That Couldn't Sleep, a study of rare deadly diseases. We'll have a chance to ask him because at the end of his talk, there will be 15 minutes for questions and answers. As a reminder, this event, including the question and answers, is being videotaped for subsequent broadcast on the library's website and other media. The audience is encouraged to offer comments and raise questions during the formal question and answer period. Please be advised that your image and/or voice may be recorded and later broadcast as part of this event. By participating in the question and answer period, you are consenting to the library's possible reproduction and transmission of your remarks. D.T. Max grew up in New York. He attended Harvard University in New England. We like to claim him as a Washingtonian because he published his 2 full-length books while he was living in the Washington area. He's gone back to New York. His research takes him all over the world. He's also, to bring up personal material, he's been very helpful to me because when my kids were in college, David Foster Wallace's novel, Infinite Jest, was first published. My kids loved it. They read every word. It's 1,100 pages. I couldn't quite get into it. It was going to be one of those intergenerational chasms that would persist for all time. But then when I read D.T.'s biography, suddenly everything clicked and I was able to go back to Infinite Jest and at least make conversation with my kids. So, since D.T. Max has lived all over most of the United States and done research all over the world, I'll ask you to join me in welcoming a distinguished literary world citizen and amateur family therapist, D.T. Max.
Well, thank you, Susan, and thanks to the National Book Festival. A slight exaggeration there. Actually, the first book, The Family That Couldn't Sleep, was written in Alexandria. The second book, Every Love Story is a Ghost Story, actually was written entirely in New Jersey. So, I mean, I'm happy to be claimed because the truth is on the first book, the Library of Congress was actually indispensable in the research, and particularly a research librarian there named Jennifer Harpster, who happens to be my escort today. So there's a happy kind of circularity in it that I came back down here with the new book, and there was Jennifer. So David Foster Wallace, you know, it's interesting. I can always sort of look out and get a general sense about how much people know about David. And I think you guys probably all know, or Susan told you, that he's responsible for what's probably, I really think there's a pretty fair claim for it being the most interesting novel of the last, 30 years, Infinite Jest, which, as Susan pointed out, is a real doorstop at 1,100 pages, but absolutely worth reading. And I'm thrilled if she read Every Love Story is a Ghost Story and it helped her to figure out where to start reading David, because I think in a lot of ways the real goal of a biographer, if he or she is any good, is finally and ultimately to take you to the writer's work. You don't always have to like the writer, although I did love David. But I think you do have to love the writer's work, or there are just so many other things that you could be doing with your time. So I'm going to read a little bit of a section that I think will take you to the key moment in David's life. And it's a section I always like to read because I think it takes in David's great theme, which is his struggle with addiction, and by extension, all of our struggles with the kind of addictive media and the kind of delights of America that keep us from doing the things that we really mean to be doing and really want to be doing. So David is born in Ithaca, New York, but grows up in Champaign-Urbana in Illinois. He's the child of academics. His father is a professor of philosophy, very good professor of philosophy. And his mother is she's a professor of English at a community college, and her real expertise is grammar. She's the kind of person, and this is in Infinite Jest, who will go up to a supermarket manager, and if she sees a sign that says, "This lane, 7 items or less," we'll go over to the store manager and explain that it really ought to be 7 items or fewer. Which was one reason I think David wanted to get out of Champaign-Urbana as soon as he could. So he's very, very smart, as you can imagine. Anyone who's even put a toe in the water of David's writing knows the first thing you know about David is that he's a genius. And he is, even in high school, experiencing kind of severe emotional problems, which are originally a kind of anxiety, a severe anxiety that makes him sweat and sweat and sweat, and then later kind of becomes a full-blown depression. But despite that, and in spite of really not having gotten any therapy or assistance of any sort, he manages to go to Amherst College, where his father went. And he's really very proud of having gone to Amherst. I mean, he's a guy who is reluctantly acknowledging his own problems slowly, very slowly. So David does incredibly well at Amherst, but he has 2 massive breakdowns there. And after the second breakdown, he begins to turn to fiction. The David of his high school years, you know, and I've seen the papers, a lot of the stuff he worked on, is not really a writer. He's just a kind of massive processor of information. I mean, he's as good at math as he is at English. I mean, he's a great English student, but he's also a great history student. And it's only with the breakdown when he's about 20 years old that David begins to focus on what he thinks of as the thing that will save him, which is writing fiction. But of course, life is more complicated than that. And so David, you know, he writes a first book called The Broom of the System. And then he goes to graduate school in fiction, an MFA program in Arizona. And he finishes a short story collection called The Girl with Curious Hair. And they're both terrific books. The first one's a big success. The second one, because of a lot of complicated things involving libel problems, turns out that what David thought of as fiction was often just what we would now call a kind of a grab. So he writes a wonderful story called My Appearance about a young woman on the David Letterman show who's meant to stand in for the actress Susan St. James, now not really a well-known name, but once well-known. And he doesn't change any of the dialogue that he picks up off of the Letterman show. And when his publisher is getting ready to publish the book, they find out to their horror, one of them is just relaxing after a long day in publishing, watching TV, and is so stunned to see the lines from David's short story, My Appearance, being spoken by Susan St. James on the David Letterman show. Anyway, these are the kinds of problems David has, and he winds up fairly early in his life, late 20s, deciding that he's really not cut out to be a fiction writer, that it's just too hard, it's too lonely, he's too neurotic, and instead he decides to go to, well, David always wanted to be the best student in his class, and he always was. I mean, he graduated from Amherst with more honors than I knew existed at a school. So he decides that what he's going to do is he's going to go to Harvard for philosophy. He's going to be a philosopher, not a writer, be less lonely, and he'll have health insurance. And he applies to Harvard and he gets in, which is fairly amazing. I mean, I'm not a philosopher, but I think, and it's sort of weird to think of philosophers as this competitive, because their minds ought to be on larger matters, but actually Harvard philosophy is a very competitive graduate program. So David goes and he can't keep up with the work. He's got a lot of freelance writing to do. He's got a lot of problems with addiction. He's basically a marijuana addict. He's drinking heavily. And he eventually has another collapse. And that collapse will prove very important both for him personally and for the novel Infinite Jest, as you'll see in a moment. But David being David, this book took its original form as a New Yorker article, and then I went back and did a great deal more work to turn it into a book. And when I wrote the New Yorker article, I always thought that what happened to David at Harvard was that he had threatened to kill himself because he was feeling those ideations, and he was immediately taken to McLean Hospital, which is a psychiatric hospital associated with Harvard, for his own protection. But I now think, knowing more about David, that actually he didn't, at that moment, though he had certainly had these urges other times, think he was going to kill himself. I think he understood that if he went in and said this, he would wind up at McLean Hospital. And I think David very much wanted to be being the best student in his class, very much wanted to be at the best mental hospital. So he sort of thought, so he goes to McLean, and he sort of thought of being at McLean as almost kind of like being at Harvard, but at the Harvard of psychiatric hospitals. So when I was researching him, I couldn't figure out why he wasn't more distressed to be at McLean Hospital. And I now realize there was a piece of him that was always highly competitive about these sorts of issues. And actually, a certain piece of him almost felt like he had landed on his feet in a really weird way to be at McLean. So anyway, he detoxes at McLean, and he fully expects to go back to Harvard and continue his storied existence as a twice published writer and now soon to be a famous philosopher. But they tell him that he has to go to a halfway house, that if he goes back to Harvard, he will just drink himself to death. And I've never really known quite how, but he winds up at a fairly rough institution, at least by the standards of a cosseted child of academia, called Granada House, which anyone who's read Infinite Jest will recognize as the Enid House of that piece of fiction. So I'm just going to read you a bit from that. And you'll see it turns out to be a kind of a crucial moment for a David who has really stopped writing. Granada House was on the grounds of the Brighton Marine Hospital near the Massachusetts Turnpike. Wallace found it funny that a marine hospital would be nowhere near water. The compound consisted of 7 buildings, 7 moons orbiting a dead planet, as he would later describe it in Infinite Jest, all leased to various substance abuse groups. Wallace met Deb Larson, the director, at his new temporary home. Tall and blonde, she walked with a limp. Drunk, she had fallen down in her kitchen, hitting her head and causing a partial paralysis. And even then, she hadn't stopped drinking. Wallace respected and liked her at once. She gave him a link to an old life that was still his present. You could almost see Harvard from the top floor of the building. Recovery facilities tried to control the stress levels of their participants, and one activity that they generally prohibited was school. Wallace had no choice but to call the philosophy department at Harvard and ask for a leave of absence. He was too humiliated to go back to get the vegetable juicer, a gift from his mother that he had left behind in the department office. Now he was expected to find low-level work. Wallace, whose only real skill was teaching and writing, cast around and was able, probably because he had put the head of Amherst College security on his resume, to get hired as a guard at Lotus Development, the large software company. Granada House rules required a 40-hour work week, so Wallace got up at 4:30 in the morning and took the Green Line subway and worked until 2 p.m., walking a vast disc packaging plant in Leechmere, clocking in his whereabouts every 10 minutes, and twirling his baton, or so he later said. Turns out I don't think he did do this. He writes letters where he says he did this, and he writes letters where he says he sat there and looked at a video screen the whole time, which seems more what a security guard actually does. And I discovered an early short story of his that nobody had found from before this time, where he has a night watchman going around twirling his baton and clocking in his whereabouts. So I think David just liked the idea from his fiction and decided to put it into his life to give himself a little taste of romance. He would tear pages out of his notebook and send letters to his friends, maintaining contact with a small group of editors and writers who were vital to him. The Lotus experience, he would recall in a later interview, reminded him of every bad 60s novel about meaningless authority, but at the time he bore it well. Give me a little time to get used to no recreational materials and wearing a polyester uniform and living with 4 tattooed ex-cons, and I'll be right as rain, he wrote to a friend with ironic brio shortly after arriving. But in his heart, he was stunned. I am, he wrote one of his Amherst professors, okay, though very humiliated and confused. He was sharing a barracks-like room with 4 men, one of whom he wrote Rich C., his sponsor in his 12-step program, had had a stroke while on cocaine and had a withered right side. Mr. Howard, he told his editor at W.W. Norton, his book publisher, everyone here has a tattoo or a criminal record or both. To his professor, he reported, most of the guys in the house are inmates on release, and while they're basically decent folk, it's just not a crowd I'm much at home with. Heavy metal music, black t-shirts and Harleys, vivid tattoos, discussion of hard versus soft time, parole boards, gunshot wounds, and Walpole, Massachusetts' toughest prison. Wallace continued at his security job for more than 2 months, and then, unable to bear getting up so early, he quit. He went to work as a front desk attendant at the Mount Auburn Club, a health club in nearby Watertown. His job was to check members in. He called himself a glorified towel boy. But one day, Michael Ryan, a poet who had received a Whiting Award alongside Wallace 2 years before, came in to exercise. Wallace dove below the reception desk and quit the same day. His friends were accustomed to his exaggerations and inventions over the years. They came with his clownish, hyperbolic personality. But when they visited him at the halfway house, they found that what he said was, in fact, true. He had stepped through a sort of looking glass. His friend Deborah Spark, a fiction writer, remembers sitting in on a group therapy session with Wallace one day and being amazed to hear someone recount killing someone else while drunk. All the same, he found his place. Order, no matter how foreign the context, was always easier for him than the unstructured world that lay outside. He met with a counselor, and nearly every evening he drove to a different part of the city with other halfway house members for substance abuse meetings. His sponsor was named Jimmy, a motorhead from the South Shore, as he called him to a friend. Wallace read the big book, the founding text of Alcoholics Anonymous, and enjoyed making fun of its cheesy 1930s ad man vocabulary to his friends. Tosspot, Dave Sheen heels, boiled as an owl. He laughed at them, but he also knew he needed them or he would die, Mark Costello, his college roommate, remembers. And if Wallace found himself in unfamiliar territory, the residents didn't know what to make of him either. One remembers thinking, this guy could probably go to Betty Ford. Why is he here with us welfare babies? No one really cared for his cleverness either. He was to them a type they'd seen before, someone who, as Wallace would later write, tries to erect denial-type fortifications with some kind of intellectualist showing off. Wallace was back in high school, trying to figure out his place in the pack. It's a rough crowd, he wrote his old Arizona sponsor, and sometimes I was scared or feel superior or both. Yet a piece of him was beginning to adjust to the new situation. He remembered his last failed attempt to get sober and how he was no longer writing, and asked himself what he had to lose. He came to understand that the key this time was modesty. He knew it was imperative to abandon the sense of himself as the smartest person in the room, a person too smart to be like one of the people in the room, because he was one of the people in the room. I try hard to listen and do what they say, he wrote Rich C., his old sponsor. I'm trying to do it easy this time, not get an A+. I just don't have enough gas right now to do anything fast or well, and I'm trying to accept this. Not that things came easily. The simple aphorisms of the program seemed ridiculous to him, and if he objected to them, someone inevitably answered him with another, telling him, for example, to do what was in front of him to do, driving him even crazier, or to take it one day at a time. He was astonished to find people talking about a higher power without any evidence beyond their wish that there were one. They got down on their knees and said the thankfulness prayer. Wallace tried once at Granada House, but it felt hypocritical. All the same, Wallace liked to quote one of the veteran recovery members, the group known in infinite jest as the Crocodiles, who told him, "It's not about whether or not you believe, asshole. It's about getting down and asking." There were many times when he was sure he would start drinking again. I'm scared, he wrote his old Arizona sponsor. I still don't know what's going to happen. He asked his friend for some words of encouragement, and just when he thought he would give up, a letter arrived in which his former sponsor recounted the last time he had been in detox. They gave me Librium, he wrote, and I threw them over my left shoulder for luck, and I've had good luck ever since. The image, Wallace wrote his sponsor years later, was just the good MFA caliber trope I needed. Stunned as he was, Wallace understood from the beginning that his fall from grace was also a literary opportunity. He had been hypothesizing beforehand about a nation enthralled to its appetites. And here he was living among its casualties. So in the midst of his misery, he was alive to the new information he was getting. The communal house, he would later write in Infinite Jest, reeks of passing time. It is the humidity of early sobriety, reeking and palpable. Wallace was known for sitting quietly, listening as residents talked for hours about their lives and their addictions. Later, residents would often be surprised to find that though he had heard their stories, they had not actually heard his. This was the sort of access to interior lives a novelist could not get elsewhere. He was finding, as he later told an interviewer, that nobody is as gregarious as somebody who has recently stopped using drugs. Wallace and his notebooks were a familiar sight in the communal rooms and recovery meetings, trapping little inspirations before they could get away. Within a few months of arriving, he had already drafted a scene centered on one of the most intriguing residents at Granada House, Big Craig. Big Craig, called Don Gately in the novel, was one of the Granada House supervisors and sometimes was also the house cook. Craig was in his mid-20s, sober and just huge, as Wallace would later write in Infinite Jest, looking less built than poured, with the smooth immovability of an Easter Island statue. The amazing thing is, you actually see these people later when you write a biography, and Big Craig sent me a picture of himself. I didn't even know what it looked like to be poured rather than built. But it really was as if somebody had taken liquid muscle, sort of taken it through some sort of a drainer and had it just follow the dictates of gravity. I mean, he's a perfectly muscled guy, but he actually didn't look like somebody who'd ever worked out. There's also a description of him in Infinite Jest that I love, describing him as having a Prince Valiant haircut, which I take to be sort of a bowl cut with this little tiny kind of curl coming down the front. And I didn't believe that anyone that massive would actually, weirdly enough, have that haircut. I just thought this was David monkeying around, because even at the beginning of my research, I knew that David's sort of adherence to truth was fitful. But it turned out that that's exactly the haircut that Big Craig had, to my astonishment. Craig had grown up on the North Shore and had been a burglar and a Demerol addict. Friends closed elevator doors on his head for fun when he was a teenager, a detail Wallace would, of course, put into Infinite Jest. But he turned out not only to come from a different world, but also to be quite sensitive. And it did not take Wallace long to see the possibilities in a lug with an interior life. There was a sort of Dostoevskian gloss to him, the redeemed criminal, and Dostoevsky was on Wallace's mind. He wrote to his Amherst professor shortly after arriving that going from Harvard to here is like House of the Dead, with my weeks in drug treatment composing the staged execution and last-minute reprieve from same. The reprieve he hoped would spur the same creative surge as it had in the Russian. So in fact, it does spur, let's say, a comparable creative surge. And we have to say that David never underestimated his own gifts, and that he was already sort of taking aim at Dostoevsky as somebody he could potentially equal in his fiction. And I think what's interesting about this passage, most of all, is that one of the sort of fascinating things about David, there's some ways in which writing a biography of David was the easiest thing you could do and the hardest. I think it was the hardest thing you could do, and it was my first biography, in that, David was a genius, and I think everybody who's that intelligent is extremely hard to follow. The things they say are complicated, the things they feel are complicated, the things they write are extraordinarily complicated. I mean, if you want hard work, try reading David's book on the history of infinity, everything and more. But the way it was easy is that when David felt something as strongly as he felt the need to become sober, he also gave that urge to his characters. So whereas you could write about a lot of authors and you'd have a very hard time, say, with a John Updike or Toni Morrison or Flaubert, figuring out the connection between the life and work. And in fact, David wrote a famous hostile piece on biography about a biography of Jorge Luis Borges. Well, I mean, when you look at Borges' fiction, I think it's extremely hard to say, well, he had a love affair, so he wrote, Pierre Menard, author of Don Quixote. I mean, it just doesn't work. I mean, you could make the argument, but to me, it's more the argument you make after a couple of beers at a dinner party. It's not really what I call a top-level argument. But with David, it's different. I mean, when David becomes sober, his characters become sober. when David starts searching for authenticity and sincerity, which is his great theme, when he starts searching for authenticity and sincerity in a troubled and addicted world, his character starts searching for authenticity and sincerity in a troubled and addicted world. I'm not saying that it becomes easy to understand what David's doing, but there's a certain kind of felicitous biographical link that I really thought of as sort of David's small gift to me as I started the work. I mean, at least for whether I was able to sort of understand his life properly, whether I was able to give the sort of love to him that I felt he deserved, these were harder questions. But I did feel at the very least that I wouldn't make a complete fool of myself, as so many biographers do when they're writing about literary figures, drawing a connection between A and B. I mean, for instance, Enid House is as much like Granada House as you can imagine. The Granada House is the halfway house in Infinite Jest. So much so that when the sort of earlier drafts of the manuscript were circulating, there was a great deal of concern about people who were too readily identified. I mean, David was not an inventive author. He was an imaginative author. I draw the distinction there. If he were going to write about this tent, the tent would still be white. There would still be a lot of white folding seats. He didn't change that. But of course, he would have put it into a very complicated milieu, something much more, I think, alive and redolent and complex than most of us perceive it as. And I think that in a lot of ways was really what turned David into, it's funny when you look at where David Foster Wallace's works are placed, or if you go on Wikipedia and look at the categorization, I was stunned by this. I saw this the other day. He sometimes pops up as a science fantasy writer because Infinite Jest is set in the near future and does involve certain kind of fantastical elements, although it's clearly a book about the 1990s in the United States. I actually think David would have been thrilled by that. I think he was always into science fantasy. But the point is that though there were difficulties, the difficulties weren't really in sort of tracing that usually very complicated relationship between an author and the internal states of his characters. In fact, just one last comment, and I take some questions. One of the fascinating things about Infinite Jest, which I learned in working on Every Love Story, is a ghost story. Everyone wonders why it feels like two novels. There's one fairly long novel about a bunch of kids at a tennis academy, and then there's another novel about a bunch of people at a halfway house, and it takes a long time for the two pieces to connect. It's one of the kind of things that stops a lot of people in reading the novel. They're described as separated by, I think, a small and denuded hill or something like that. So he's put them near each other, but there's almost no interaction for half of the book. And they almost seem like two different books because, the part with the tennis players is kind of fun and clever and closer maybe to David's nonfiction. And then there's this character, Don Gately, who I mentioned in this section of Every Love Story, who's really something out of Dostoevsky. And you kind of wonder, how can these two figures coexist in a single novel? I mean, there's a creative reason, which I think is almost entirely successful, but there's also a biographical reason. And the biographical reason is really he started the novel with one set of characters, and as he went through these difficult shocks in his life, which I just read to you, he began to care about a whole different set of characters, and he found, I think, an ingenious, but certainly slightly gimcrack way of suturing them together. Anyway, that's just an introduction to David, and I'd now be happy to answer questions or just go on in the vein in which I began. And I think, is somebody going, Susan, are you going to call on people, or how do we do it? Oops, sorry.
Well, the festival is organized by librarians, and we're terribly orderly. So we have microphones throughout the pavilion. If you'd come up to a microphone and stand in line, when you're first in line, you ask your question. Let me take advantage of my being at the microphone to point out that David's book, DT's book, Every Love Story is a Ghost Story, is for sale in the pavilion right next door. It is on the contemporary life table, not the biography table. Okay.
Sorry, before we take a question, I think that's an example of librarians showing some flexibility, not what they're always known for, because I think what happened is, I was very honored and thrilled to be coming here because David's such a recent figure. It would be 5 years ago, just last week, that he had died. And the idea of a biography of Wallace sitting there with a biography of Jackson, a biography of Simon Bolivar, and a biography of George Washington just seemed really weird. And somebody in their kindness and their imagination realized that it really sat much more with books like Andrew Solomon's book about his family, the book about being Christian and gay in America. I mean, it was really an issue of contemporary life. And so it was graciously moved, and therefore my tent moved. Anyway, ready for the first question.
Hi, thank you.
Sure.
Can you talk a bit about his childhood in terms of, was there a great deal of disorder? And I don't mean that literally orderly, but mentally,
Right.
anxiety, etc. And then the second question is about psychotropic medication. And I do believe that it's either your book, I've read or I've heard that he had been taking antidepressants and stopped taking.
Right.
That's it.
Okay, sure. So the two questions are, and I think the implicit idea of the first question is, if David was such a mess, can we trace it to his childhood? And the second one wasn't he taking something for his depression? So the first question is, I think that David is an example of somebody for whom you want to find proximate or direct causes for all the things he suffered. But I think one thing that makes him a kind of an interesting and a larger figure for us, and someone we could connect to more directly, is it's really not, we really can't look at his child. I mean, he had loving parents. They made more than their share of mistakes as I make as a parent. He explores to his own satisfaction in some of his stories things that he felt were wrong in his childhood, and you're welcome to look at some of his story collections, but I didn't really read his childhood entirely that way. I really read David as a kid like me. He would have been 1 year younger than me were he alive today, who basically experienced the pressures and confusions of growing up in the 1970s in America. Everything from the music to the drugs to the idea of parenting at the time. And then finally, you just have to acknowledge that, he had this brutal depression, and I think a huge amount of that was really just biological. I mean, I'm not sure that David in any home would have grown up vastly different. Second question, he took a drug for most of his life called Nardil, an antidepressant. He's taking it during the section I read to you, actually, and one of the great struggles for him, because David always wants to be the best in his class, is he very much wants to take no drugs, because there's a school of these 12-step programs that says antidepressants are a kind of crutch. And unfortunately, David listens to that eventually, and towards what would turn out to be the end of his life, he goes off of the Nardil. This is a story I tell in the biography. I think the reason he went off of the Nardil most of all, Nardal, it's an old-style antidepressant long before Prozac. I think the reason he goes off of it really is because he's trying to finish a novel called The Pale King. Pale King came out after his death, but he never finished it during his life. And I think it was just eating him up alive not to be able to finish this book. And he thought if he could just maybe get out from the sort of sense of, antidepressants they don't make you feel perfect, they just make you feel better. And he was looking for a different sensation and maybe an ability to get back into his book. And so that's the very, very sad story that I tell in the last pages of every love story as a ghost story, is that David makes the fatal mistake of getting off of the drug, promising his wife he's going to go on a different antidepressant, and then never actually going on another antidepressant. Yeah.
Yes. I was a student of Wallace's at Illinois State, and
Where?
Illinois State, and his grad fiction. Anyway, can you tell us a little bit about, in the book, if there's anything about his teaching, either at Panoma or Illinois State or elsewhere, or what it might have done for him?
Sure. I mean, you may be able to tell more than I can. Were you a graduate student or an undergraduate of his?
I was a graduate student. I was a co-classmate of William Gillespie.
Oh, yeah, sure. Tell me your name, if you would.
Don Illich.
Right. One of the pleasures of talking about David, because he was such a recent person, is that often there are people who knew him personally who come up or talk, and I didn't know David. I mean, that's the thing, that I knew a lot of people who knew David. David and I were in kind of similar circles. I know that David knew who I was because when I started researching the biography, I found something in his notebooks where he wrote, I'd written an article and he quoted a bit of the article, and next to it he wrote the words Dan Max. So if you know me, you know DT is just my strange pen name. It's really Daniel. So it was a very pleasant moment, but the closest we ever got was at the publication party for Infinite Jest, the great novel, where, I didn't know much about David. You would have known more than I did at the time, because that's around the time that you would have studied with him. But, it was a party thrown in a huge bar, full of media and film and savvy types like that, New York types. And I would later learn that David didn't drink. I mean, I saw him, he looked miserable, and I thought, well, I wonder why he's so miserable. What's he got to be miserable about? He didn't drink. He was agoraphobic, so that's two, right? And he completely hated media people. So it was sort of like his personal room 101 to send him into this experience. About the teaching, yeah, I had a lot of people from Illinois State. David teaches for years at Illinois State, which has a very good graduate program in experimental fiction. People always think, like, why did he bury himself at Illinois State? Because, that's how people think on both coasts. But actually, or even in Chicago, they think that way. But it was a great school with a great program. And it had a lot of really good experimental English language publications going on there. He was an imaginative teacher, as you could probably say better than I could. He was an impassioned teacher. He was not always a great teacher, I think, because it was very hard for him to get out of the way of his own experiences. As a writer, he sort of was allergic to anyone who had the kind of precocious talent that he had. If you want to go online, there, as he would say, knock yourself out. There are these wonderful syllabuses that David produced that are very much worth looking at. I quote some of them in every love story as a ghost story, but if you go online, they're absolutely terrific syllabuses where you can see, for instance, when he teaches undergraduate English, he'll teach a combination of sort of high art and then, a Thomas Harris novel or a Tom Clancy novel to teach narrative and structure and things like that. So, yeah, there's plenty in the book, but I mean, there's always more to be learned about David. Thanks.
Hello. I was wondering if you could talk about your own personal decision to pursue such a big person, such a big topic. Like, could you isolate a moment or
Sure.
reason that really pushed you to pursue?
Yeah, I mean,
biography?
I can do my best. I was a Wallace reader, but I wasn't a Wallace fanatic. Anytime I talk, there are at least 15 people in the audience, even if there are only 15 people in the audience, who know more about Wallace's writing than I do and have studied every page of Infinite Jest in a way I never have. I was a reader. I was actually a big fan of his first novel, Broom of the System. And when I started doing the work for the New Yorker piece that led to Every Love Story, I came upon a letter that David had written to John Franzen, in which, this is only about 3 years after Broom of the System is published, in which he says he hates the book, and it could have been written by a smart 14-year-old. So I was kind of humiliated because I love that book, and I had it right there on my night table to read and reread. But he was right. I mean, he had gone way beyond it. After his death, the editor of the New Yorker, David Remnick, emailed me and asked me, did I want to write about David? And I have to admit, I had not been a close reader of his for some time. I mean, one of the truths about David that we don't recognize today now that he's so famous again is that he'd sort of semi-disappeared. He was living in that place that we reserve for writers whose best work is now 5-10 years behind them, and who instead are mostly known for, for like books that are complicated that critics tend to praise but don't really understand. But as I began the New Yorker piece, I understood more and more how passionate I felt, not only about David and his writing, but also about the way that he had tried to negotiate the demands of the modern world. And I saw more and more, my story and his story, as people always have. I mean, there's different kinds of people who see their story and David's story. Certainly many people who had trouble with depression and addiction identify with David. But I think a whole generation, really generations before and after, have also begun to understand that his sort of struggles to live a meaningful life are really the sort of essential struggles we all live, even if we're not all that aware of it. So I wrote the New Yorker piece, and then these New Yorker pieces are long. They're like 3-month-long love affairs, and then they end abruptly. It's like, she left town, left you a note. And you have to find a way to continue the love if you want to. And so I also just had this strong desire to keep reading David. I mean, David, Infinite Jest is not a book to be read in a hurry. And so I was looking for an excuse to reread David, and I found that excuse in starting on the biography. I mean, the truth is I love David. I was always looking for, the reason the book, Every Love Story Has a Ghost Story, has that title, is I was always trying to find the real David under the Davids. It was a kind of a game of Chinese boxes. I mean, there was no answer. But in that sense, it was an enormously intriguing battle for somebody like me who felt so close to him to begin with. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. So in your research for the book, you interviewed a lot of his friends and focused on letters. I'm curious what your opinion is on what kind of friend he was. Was he a good friend? Was he able to be a good friend?
So the question is, was David a good friend? Was he able to be a friend? And I mean, I'm a little bit hesitant to sort of make my judgment on that. I mean, you can kind of, you can read the biography if you're so inclined and make your own conclusions. I think everything was a struggle for David. I think it was a struggle to be a friend. It was a struggle to be present for people. It was a struggle that he often failed at. He certainly did some miserable things to people, but he was also kind of remarkably present in other cases where you would have thought that he would have, lit out for the hills. I think, the hard thing about David as a friend, and one of the things that I think aided the writing of the book, is that he left almost everybody dissatisfied. And after his death, and I mean, there's no more abrupt leave-taking than a suicide, I think. Everybody had this feeling that they wanted to know more, including his closest friends. And they all sort of paid in the sense that they all talked to me or gave me letters and material, because they all wanted to know who was this guy who kind of passed through their lives and whom they'd only seen, a portion of. So, would I have wanted to be David's friend? Absolutely. Would I have had to accept that there'd be times when David would, disappoint me? Either by, well, I don't even want to go into the details, but simply not being what we think of as a friend, yes. Would I have finally been just enormously touched by how hard it was for him to do things that most of us can do fairly easily? There's a wonderful moment when he marries. He marries Karen Green at the end of his life, and they have an incredibly happy relationship for the period that is left to him. And he's so thrilled. There's this moment I recount in the book where he takes out the garbage and makes her a cup of tea when she's driving home. And he's just so proud of himself, like this guy who wrote this wonderful novel, this amazing work of genius, that he's sort of come into being as a full, come in and become a full human being in what many of us would think of as these fairly trivial ways. So I don't know if that answers your question. I mean, a lot of people think when they read an author who means a great deal to them that author would be a great friend. And I think most of us by now realize, there's a more tricky equation. An author can give the best and most available part of himself in his pages. That said, I mean, there are many people who love him and who feel like they had real relationships and connections to him, but perhaps even more, who feel as if kind of now you see him, now you don't. I think I believe I'm seeing lip syncing that's time, or we have time. I have 1 minute, but I have no clue what to say in that minute, and I'm not really a librarian nor a timekeeper, so I'm just going to say thank you to all of you, and thank you to the Library of Congress. Thank you for coming on a beautiful day.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.